Bridget Barrett from the world of Whistleblowers, and I'm here with my co-host, former FBI Special Agent and Legal Advisor, Jason T. Brown.
Hi, Bridget. It's a pleasure to be here. Looking forward to another great episode of World of Whistleblowers. I really enjoyed a lot of the feedback that we received from people who watched the video, and hope people have questions and comments. Definitely leave them below. But again, if it's something confidential, just ask to be reached out. Nothing along the lines of something that could potentially compromise somebody's case.
Well, let's jump right into the news. Now that the 2023 fiscal report for the False Claims Act has been released, we see that $2.68 billion was recovered for whistleblowers under the False Claims Act. And with your law firm, Brown LLC, securing some major victories for whistleblowers. What did you think about the report?
Well, yes, some more major victories for whistleblowers, thanks to the hard work of a lot of people from Brown LLC. Not just us or other firms that in the whistleblower space, although it's a very small niche who successfully litigate False Claims Act litigation. In aggregate, we're able to obtain $2.68 billion in recovery for the taxpayers, money that was allegedly defrauded from the taxpayers going back to the coffers of the federal government. So when you look over the report, you also find out that in aggregate, there's been $75 billion through the False Claims Act recovered. So you start doing the math, whistleblowers are entitled to, under the False Claims Act, anywhere between 15 and 30%. Let's say that averages to 20%. That's $15 billion over the years that have gone to whistleblowers. Individuals who are courageous enough to come forward in the right way, blow the whistle the right way with the False Claims Act, and obtain a recovery that's meaningful and meaty for the taxpayers as well as themselves along the way. Although there is one thing I do need to point out about the whistleblower report. When you look at it from the federal government, I don't know what to make of it, but they misspelt the word judgments. They did a good job elsewhere, but in the first paragraph, they get it right without the E. Second one, they do it wrong and do the old English spelling. Well, the government's the government. They do some great work, but there's also some great concerns at times.
Well, I'm sure whistleblowers won't mind too much about a misspelled word here and there, as long as the government keeps paying them. So speaking of which, is there a new whistleblower program on the horizon, Jason?
Well, the federal government has announced pretty excitingly, if that's a word, that there will be a new whistleblower program coming forth, the details to emerge in the next, maybe even as soon as 60 days. There's some catch-all provisions in this new whistleblower program, where in the past, the False Claims Act only deals with squarely fraud against the federal government. And there's a lot of corporate malfeasance out there, corporations who may be engaged in criminal conduct that don't squarely fit into any existing program like the SEC whistleblower program. Perhaps they've committed a Foreign Corrupt Practices Act violation in which they bribed a foreign official, which doesn't squarely implicate the False Claims Act. Well, the federal government has looked for a mechanism to close that loophole and hold corporations and entities who engage in other sorts of systemic corporate fraud accountable. We're looking forward to the emergence of the details of this program. If it's anything like their other whistleblower programs that have come into prominence over the last decade, such as the SEC whistleblower program, CFTC whistleblower program, it stands to also have upsides of recapturing billions of dollars for the taxpayers, billions of dollars for the government, and along the way, rewarding whistleblowers for having their information. So if individuals have sat on corporate malfeasance or been told in the past, hey, there's nothing we can do as a whistleblower, now's the time to revisit that information to see if the information you've provided potentially is actionable under the new program.
Sounds interesting. Definitely looking forward to hearing more details about that. Well, let's discuss some of the results in the report. Medicare fraud definitely still seems to be a hotbed for fraud.
Yeah, Medicare fraud is one of the biggest areas. It's a bloated budget. Medicare has to do with the federal government paying for health care for individuals over a certain age or with certain types of conditions. Its ancillary is Medicaid. In 2023, based upon the report, we saw some tremendous results with the Medicare Advantage. Medicare Advantage is a complicated hybrid program that involves private insurance and the Medicare program. In it, it has a complex way of scoring certain encounters. It uses things called rug scores and other types of scores. But basically, allegedly, the Cigna group had used some complicated schemes within that program to, I won't say necessarily submit, but it did submit, but it failed to withdraw, is very precise language, inaccurate and untruthful diagnosis codes, which in turn led to higher levels of reimbursement than it was entitled to. And in the end, even though things are allegations in these reports, they did pay $172 million under the False Claims Act for alleged Medicare fraud, resulting, if we use the 20% rule, benchmark $35 million for the whistleblowers that had the courage to step forward with this information. So yes, Medicare fraud still is one of the primary focuses and will maintain that focus for many years to come.
And what about unnecessary services and substandard care claims? Did I see something about that?
Yeah, there is some scary stuff with unnecessary services and substandard claims. Cornerstone Hospital Medical Center left no corner unturned when it came to alleged fraud against the federal government. And when you talk about substandard services, they paid $21.6 million for allegedly allowing students, just students, to do certain medical procedures and medical work on patients within its facilities.
Students, unlicensed students were allegedly doing medical work and billing the government.
It's crazy when you think about it. You entrust your loved one to a facility and you expect them to get the highest level of care. And here, allegedly, they had the lowest level of care, where they just had students who were not licensed in any sense of the word to perform any medical work, doing medical work at those facilities. Again, it's alleged, but God, if my loved one was there, it certainly would give me a big headache.
Yes. And speaking of headaches, let's make sure to treat headaches with over-the-counter medication as opposed to what some may refer to as the good stuff. Speaking of opioids, and that leads us into some of the next recoveries.
The federal government, well, opioids, that's a good one, Bridget. So, the opioid epidemic is still widely discussed in the media, and the reverberations of what had once happened is still coming to certain reckonings. In 2023, we saw Rite Aid, in which the federal government has intervened, meaning that it's decided based upon False Claims Act complaints that it will proceed with the litigation to try to hold it accountable for a lot of the opioid epidemic that we saw for almost a decade and still may continue to today. Also, Endo Pharmaceuticals has gone through Chapter 11, which is a bankruptcy, to try to readjust its exposure to this opioid epidemic. But really, the federal government is not done holding entities accountable. And I predict we're going to see more really earth-shattering record results in 2024 and beyond while the federal government takes the time to address the opioid epidemic.
Mm-hmm. And kickbacks definitely still seem to be rearing their ugly head. I do see a case on the list that may look pretty recognizable to your firm.
Yeah, there's the Carter Healthcare case, which our firm litigated for at least 5-6 years and was a wonderful, roughly $23 million result. Carter Healthcare is just one example of alleged kickbacks. In that instance, our firm was able to unearth through the relators/whistleblowers that essentially there was a paper party going on. Physicians were allegedly shuttling their patients to Carter Healthcare in exchange for a fancy title, some premium pay, but nothing more than a paper party where they would just go and just go into a room and just sign some documents and not do any substantive work that would entitle them to premiums above fair market value. And that's one of the key terms when you look at kickbacks. Is something given that's well above fair market value? A lot of times you'll see kickbacks in Stark law, which is also self-dealing, rear its head when you talk about practices that are purchased and a new entity purchases it well above fair market value to absorb their Medicare/Medicaid patient census, when in fact the fair market value is far below. But kickbacks could be anything. It could be junkets for lavish vacations, which could be to Bahamas, Antigua, anywhere. It could be speaking fees for physicians far in excess of fair market value when those speaking fees are directly correlated with something like in pharmaceutical fraud, not how good of a speaker the individual is, but they're correlated with, in fact, how much they prescribe a particular product or how much they use a particular service. So kickbacks are everywhere. Important to note also, False Claims Act has civil components and criminal components, as well as some of the opioid does as well. With kickbacks, the federal government generally will take a hard look to see if there's any criminal liability or culpability when people are using inducements to obtain government business.
In other 2023 topics was the procurement fraud. What is that?
Well, procurement fraud actually is the hotbed and the bedrock of what the False Claims Act initially was enacted for. Sometimes referred to as the Lincoln Law. It was when defense contractors back in Abraham Lincoln's day were making the federal government overpay for different services. And procurement fraud is really always a priority for the federal government. Those cases tend to be in the hundreds of millions of dollars. And it's when entities who've contracted with the federal government to provide things for the defense contractor space overbill the government. And a lot of times that overbilling, unfortunately, manifests itself in a manner in which our soldiers and service members, who God bless them, put their life on the line for the country, are receiving substandard equipment and gear because of the profits of the entity. Horrific. And as a result, when you start thinking through that type of conduct, the federal government has every incentive to continue to prioritize this as something that they will hold accountable in fiscal year 2024 and beyond.
And another topic that we all sort of predicted maybe coming was the pandemic fraud, the PPP loan fraud.
There's no end to PPP loan fraud. The federal government, in its haste during the pandemic, offered a lifeline to many different businesses. In that lifeline, they didn't ask for a whole bunch of a lot of verification, and they just handed out a whole lot of money. Despite the paucity of information it requested, there still was rampant fraud. There still was failure on banks on the fundamental level to verify or audit information it already had at its disposal to confirm that the businesses were indeed legitimate businesses, that the censuses were accurate. I expect to see a lot more PPP loan fraud cases brought in 2024 and 2025. The federal government really is making a point about this. It has prioritized this. There's a couple different tracks which can, work through its own video at some point. But there's the insiders, who I think are much more coveted by the federal government in any capacity, but certainly PPP loan fraud. And there's the outsiders who are data mining to try to cobble together the cases. Those, I think, the federal government is really going to scrutinize before bequeathing a good award. Make me eat my words. One of the first cases that was successful in PPP loan fraud was brought by a colleague of mine, and that individual was an outsider. Notwithstanding that, I think the more actionable cases from the whistleblower's perspective under the False Claims Act are companies that received hearty loans like $10 million or above and failed to disclose that it wasn't eligible. Sometimes you'll get that by them juking their NAICS code and falsely stating what type of business they are because they weren't eligible, or concealing a whole network of interrelated companies, which had the federal government and the SBA known about the interrelated companies, wouldn't have issued the loan in the first place. So yeah, there's a lot of PPP loan fraud out there, and there's a lot of more reckoning in that area as well.
Well, speaking of 2024 and the year ahead, what do you think we can expect to see for the rest of the year?
Well, we've seen pretty much a baseline over the last decade of $2 billion or more under the False Claims Act almost every year. And I think we're going to see that trend continue. I think we'll see that continue not just to 2024, but probably the next decade. I mean, Jeff Sessions, when he's the Attorney General, he made a speech that he thought that there was healthcare fraud in the tens of billions of dollars. So when you've only gotten $2 billion, you've only scratched the surface to what's really out there. And that's just healthcare fraud. You add in defense contractor fraud, PPP loan fraud, which I think a lot of people will be civilly and criminally prosecuted in that context, I think you're going to see a lot more of those cases. And depending on, it's an election year, I think both administrations, Republican and Democrat, can agree, and you see bipartisan support in Congress, that if you commit fraud against the government, it should be remedied. There should be a mechanism to incentivize individuals and hold those corporate entities accountable for their misconduct. And I think you're going to see a lot more of that. You can see some already, I'll say, some real excitement in the Department of Justice, how well certain programs have succeeded in its initiative to create a new program for whistleblowers for corporate malfeasance. I think you're going to see in 2024 or 2025 the inaugural anti-money laundering whistleblower award. I expect it to be pretty meaty. And if I'm using my clairvoyance or crystal ball and psychic abilities, I'll say we'll probably have to do squarely with money that went through the banks from prohibited entities, sanctioned entities. If I'm even being more psychic, I'll say it has to do with Russian prohibited sanctioned entities using U.S. banks, and we'll see something along those lines. We'll probably also see a big one under KYC, Know Your Client, where a major financial entity has failed to even take the most cursory examination of who's using its banking infrastructure in order to do different things. Doesn't mean that there's cryptocurrency or fraud along those lines. It just means even the elemental failure to know its own client will trigger a potential AML award. I also expect to see some more SEC, even though we talked about just the False Claims Act report, some major SEC developments and SEC awards going forward.
Excellent. Well, it sounds like 2023 was a fantastic year for under the False Claims Act and for whistleblowers. I'm excited to see how 2024 pans out.
I am as well, Bridget. I'm sure we'll have plenty more news to report and hopefully some more results from my law firm, albeit this is our news program. Once again, I opened with, and I also invite individuals to contact us below. Don't at all put any confidential privileged information. But if there's a topic you'd like us to expand on or expound upon, happy to do so. Thank you for listening. Smash the like button if you liked it. If you didn't like it, let us know as well. Thank you all, and God bless whistleblowers. Thank you for standing up for what's right.